All right, well, welcome everyone. Like Christy said, it is a beautiful spring evening. My wife and I just got back from a long walk with our dog and saw a number of people out piddling in their gardens, so that the garden fever is affecting us all. So what we're going to talk about today is composting, and it's going to be focused on kind of composting for the homeowner. This is really not intended to be a deep technical dive into composting. It's not intended to be composting for industrial or huge amounts of compost. It's really going to be focused on composting for the homeowner. So hopefully that works out for everyone.
Bill, I'm going to interrupt 1 second. I did forget to mention that if people do have questions, please go ahead and type them into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. I will hold on to those and we will talk about those questions and answer them after the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Christy. Before we get going, I want to talk a little bit. My name is Bill Goergon, and I am one of the University of Minnesota Extension Master Gardeners. I want to talk a little bit about the Master Gardener program. There are a number of Master Gardener programs throughout the state of Minnesota, and the Master Gardener program is really about training volunteers. So there is a significant amount of education that goes into becoming a Master Gardener, and a significant amount of volunteer work that goes into becoming a Master Gardener. And the whole point is to provide kind of research-based information. So the University of Minnesota Extension Master Gardener program goes to great lengths to make sure that the things we talk about, the advice we give, the counsel, is all research-based. So there's a ton of gardening information on YouTube and a lot of other sources, some of it good, some not good. The work that's done in the Master Gardener program is all intended to say this is the best practice based on the knowledge of the University of Minnesota Extension Service. As a point of perspective, last year in Carver-Scott, the Carver-Scott Master Gardener program had about 4,000 volunteer hours last year. So that's really significant. Unfortunately, I think this year with our shelter at home orders and the whole coronavirus, it's going to be significantly less. But through Christy's guidance, we've started programs like Webinar Wednesday, and there's a talk on Saturday morning, and some other things that are done remotely to try and help people understand and get more out of their kind of gardening experience. The Master Gardener program is really about building a stronger Minnesota. Statewide, the Master Gardener program contributed about 144,000 hours last year. So that's the equivalent of about 18,000 8-hour days of volunteer work, either helping schools, helping individuals, helping programs, working county fairs, working helplines, working at the Arboretum, whatever it might be that people can spend their time kind of sharing the knowledge. And then the other point that's significant on this chart is statewide, there's a bit less than 2,500 Master Gardeners. So it's a really widespread program. I would encourage people, if you have an interest in gardening or any of the things listed on this chart, that you really look into the program. It really is a great experience. Master Gardening is about more than gardening.
Bill?
Yeah.
Bill, I'm sorry. If you are meaning to share your presentation, I just want to make sure that everyone can see it.
Oh, really?
For a second. I just want to make sure. Now it looks good.
So people can see this? Christy, can people see this? Could someone raise their hand or get to Christy and say if you can actually see the screen? Because I am indeed showing a presentation here.
Yep, it looks like they are able to see it now. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, let me back up. I just want to say the Master Gardener program is about a lot of different areas. It's about horticulture and diversity and pollinators and clean water and climate change and food and nearby nature. So again, if you've got an interest in any of these, I would really encourage you to look into the Master Gardener program. So these are two very important websites for anybody that has an interest in kind of horticulture or gardening in any area. The first one of these is just the University of Minnesota Extension website. This is a very user-friendly website that you can go to and say, hey, what plant is this? What's the problem with my plant? How do you grow tomatoes? How do you compost? any of those, please. It is a very friendly site. And as I said, there's a lot of information out there on the internet, but everything on this site has been tried and tested and proven by the university, the extensive research staff at the University of Minnesota. It's really good, high quality stuff. The second thing I want to talk about is the Master Gardener Helpline. If you have a question about any of the areas we've talked about, you can call this number and leave a question, and a Master Gardener will pick it up, research, and then contact you back, either by phone or by email, whatever you prefer. So the way I think about it is if you want to look it up yourself, you can look at the University of Minnesota Extension website. If you don't find an answer there or you want somebody to help you, you can call the Master Gardener Helpline. And then, like I said, people call in, and then Master Gardeners throughout the state will research the answer and get back to you with what you're looking for. So that's my commercial on the Master Gardening program. As you can tell, I'm pretty high on the program. It's been a great experience. Okay, so let's get to the point here. Let's talk composting. As I said, this is really about composting for the masses. There is a definition of compost, and essentially it's allowing the naturally occurring microbes to convert yard, garden, and household waste to an organic soil additive or mulch. That to me is pretty boring. As I said, this is not, I don't know if we have any organic chemists in the audience, but that's really not what this is about. This is going to be about composting for the masses. And I think of it like this, you know, the reason you compost is to take those things, yard, garden, kitchen waste, and turn it into valuable additives to your soil, right? So it adds organics, it increases your soil's ability to hold water, it improves drainage, it increases the environment for the microbe population that actually converts fertilizer so your plants can actually uptake it and help it grow. And it's just very satisfying to say, I've got all this green and organic and brown waste, and you turn it into something that's really good for your soil, for your garden, kind of wherever you choose to use it. So that's really what we're trying to do here with compost. One of the questions that we get frequently about composting is, how much work is it to compost? And my answer to that is, if it's done right, it's not much work. And you'll notice my little ampersand by there. That statement is my statement. I've been composting for over 25 years now. I didn't find that officially on the University of Minnesota website, but it really is not much work. It's not do it once and forget it, and then a miracle compost applies, but it's just something you need to pay a little attention to every couple of weeks, and you're going to end up with this really good additive to add to your lawn, add to your soil. And we'll talk more about the work of composting in a little bit, but that's a frequent question and kind of a frequent barrier we hear is, gosh, if I start composting, how much work is it? So what does it take to compost? The biggest thing is you need compostable material, and the compostable material has to be in a size that's going to work for you. Not too big, so you can't compost, you know, inch thick sticks. That takes forever. And it can't be too small. If it's too small, quite honestly, it compacts too close together, and it doesn't allow the oxygen in for the kind of microbial action to occur that converts your yard, garden waste, kitchen waste into compost. So not too big, not too small, couple of inch pieces is kind of the best. So for it to work, you do need nitrogen, oxygen. You've got to have some source of the microorganisms. You've got to have water and free space. So that's kind of like at a high level what it takes to compost. Another way to think of it is, gosh, I need some sort of structure, something to put my compost in. I need a source for microbes, and we'll talk about that. You know, it's got to have oxygen. If it doesn't have oxygen, that's a problem. We'll talk about that as well. You know, water and heat, those two things help kind of start and maintain the microbial process. And your compostable material is not too big and not too small, you know, a couple of inches. And you take that and put it into kind of what I think of as terms that we can all understand better. You know, you can compost leaves, coffee grounds, fruit and vegetable scraps, leftover garden plants. You know, at the end of the year, you want to pull your tomato plants up. You know, small twigs, faded flowers, weeds, straw, household kitchen materials. So you're cutting up a green pepper, what do you do with the core? You're an apple, what do you do with the core? Or You're making broccoli and you've got the stem that you're not going to use in your dish. All that kitchen material works. You can use a certain amount of shredded newspaper, but you want to make sure it's not more than 10% of the pile. Shredded newspaper does compost. If it gets too much, quite honestly, it sticks too close together. It doesn't allow the oxygen to permeate the pile. And then wood ash and eggshells. I want to talk a little bit about those last two because we always get a lot of questions. Can I put eggshells in my compost pile? And the answer to that is yes, you can compost eggshells if you rinse them out first. So you don't want to put raw egg in your compost pile. You don't want to put kind of any animal or anything that kind of turns into an animal, I guess, in your compost pile. So if you want to rinse your eggshells and put them in, they definitely compost. Over the years, my feeling is by the time you crack an egg and rinse it, put it in the compost pile, the benefit to the pile, how much you get when an eggshell compost, you get a speck of compost. To me, it's more work than it's worth, but I know people that, have done that for years. So, but the key is it's got to be rinsed if you put it in. The other thing that we hear about is wood ash. I've got a fire in my backyard. Can I compost that? And the answer is a little. You can't put too much wood ash in. Wood ash, it's burned, so it doesn't have any nitrogen components. But what it does have, it's like a base. So if your wood pile, or if your compost pile is too acidic, you can add a little wood ash, kind of like lime, to help bring it down into a proper pH level. But as this kind of says, you just want a little, a half cup for 5 gallons of compost. You got to be careful you don't get too much in, or it actually stalls the compost process itself. So hopefully that makes sense. The way I think of this stuff is you actually need nitrogen and you need carbon for this to work. So I think of it as green stuff versus brown stuff. And leaves are brown, coffee grounds are brown, fruit and vegetable scraps are green, leftover garden plants are green, twigs are brown, flowers are green, weeds are green. And you got to make sure in your compost pile you have a mix of the green and brown, which is actually carbon and nitrogen. Typically the pile's got in terms of physical makeup more green stuff, more nitrogen, but you do need some of the brown stuff. You do need some of the compost, or some of the carbon to help support. So, nitrogen, carbon, like I said, I don't know how many people here are chemists. Think of it as green stuff and brown stuff, and you've got to have roughly, mostly green stuff, but a significant amount of brown stuff in there for your compost stuff to work. So it's very difficult to compost if you're only composting a single ingredient, just leaves, or what's very common is just grass clippings. If you've just got a single ingredient, the compost tends to stall. So you want a mix of ingredients in your compost pile. So hopefully that makes sense. And we'll come back to that, green stuff and brown stuff. We'll come back to that more in the presentation. Just as important is what not to compost. What don't you want to throw in your compost pile? And that is any animal byproduct is not a good idea. So meat, bones, grease, dairy products, whole eggs. You don't want any of those kind of animal byproducts in your compost pile. And the answer is because that stuff tends to rot rather than compost. And you want to make sure that you don't introduce something to your compost pile that's going to be foul and not good forever it goes on. So, the process of breaking down meat and grease is just very different than the process of breaking down garden plants and leaves. You don't want to put any human or animal waste on there. And the animal waste is really saying if the animal waste is from an animal that eats meat, you definitely don't want to do that. Later, we're going to talk about the source of microbes, and one of the good sources of microbes can be manure, right? But manure that comes from, a cow or a horse, something that doesn't eat meat. Kind of for the same reason as the animal byproducts, is that meat product can pass through, and then, like I said, that rots, and the process is very different than composting. You want to be a little bit careful about diseased plants or infected plants. In a perfect world, the compost gets hot enough and it will mitigate most disease and insects. But compost is an inexact science. And if you've got plants that are diseased, I just wouldn't take the risk of throwing it in your compost pile, having it go through, and the next year spreading that disease on your garden or lawn again, maybe farther. So, like I said, in a perfect world, you can probably get away with that, but composting is an inexact science. So I really recommend against that. The second thing is weeds that have an abundance of seeds. It's kind of the same thing. In a perfect world, the compost pile is going to get hot enough to kill those seeds. But what can happen is it's hot enough right in the middle of the pile, but some seeds are on the edge. It doesn't quite reach that temperature, still turns into compost, and next year you're spreading those weed seeds out in your lawn, out in your garden, wherever you're doing it. So be careful with those plants that have got a real abundance of weed seeds. You know, you don't want to sow things that have been chemically treated or have got herbicides or insecticides on it. Same thing, you know, if the process doesn't kill it, you're just going to be spreading that around next year. Too much grass clippings, and again, this is a question we get frequently: can I compost my grass clipping? As a master gardener, I have to say the proper thing to do with grass clippings is to leave them on the lawn. They quickly decompose and are a great source of nitrogen for your lawn. But for some people, for some reasons, you know, they collect those grass clippings, and you can't have too many grass clippings. The reason is, if they're by themselves, they pack together, and we've all seen this where grass gets wet and packs together and forms like a gooey mess rather than something that's turning into compost. And that's kind of like, it gets not enough space for oxygen, and the process becomes anaerobic without oxygen rather than aerobic with oxygen, and that's a problem. You also don't want to throw colored newspaper in because there's funny dyes in those colors that aren't good for your for your plants and gardens. So hopefully that makes sense. The big thing is, you know, no animal byproducts, nothing with diseases, no chemicals, not too much colored or grass clippings. Yeah, so what you're really doing with your compost is you're trying to like capture and turn it into organic matter. It all starts from organic matter and it turns into compost. I want to point out the picture on the left, which is a really simple compost bin. This picture came from the University of Minnesota website, but it's just somebody had some extra pallets and they just like stuck 4 of them together and they just used that for their compost bin. You can tell it's nothing fancy. You can imagine people dumping leaves and garden stuff in there and their kitchen piece in there. It's easy to open the door, it's easy to turn. We'll talk a little bit more about the structure, but here in Minnesota, because we have a relatively short season and because it doesn't get real hot, it's really important that you've got a structure to kind of keep your compost piled up on each other. You don't want to leave it outside of a structure, and then as you turn it, it kind of spreads out, and you know, rain and wind spreads it around. What happens then is it loses the critical mass to continue the compost process. That's really the purpose of the structure, just to keep it together so that it you know, like I said, here in Minnesota, it doesn't get that hot. I have a friend in Texas who doesn't do this, but Texas, you know, they'll have a bunch of days that are over 90 degrees. And here in Minnesota, we might get a couple of summer. The picture on the right is kind of interesting. They are just taking garden or kitchen scraps, it looks like, have dug a small trench in the garden and are putting the compost, putting the scraps right in it, cover it up, and in most cases, that will decompose, and within a week or two, it will turn into compost. I know people that plant their garden and then will dig a trench between the rows, and then in the rows put their kitchen scraps, pile up, it turns into compost, and then the next year, that's where they plant the following year. But that's also a pretty viable way and a thing to do with your kitchen scraps, particularly, that it can have got, you know, more water content and decompose and compost very quickly. A very common question with compost is, will it stink? Or my compost stinks. And the response to that is, if you're doing compost right, it won't stink. And if it stinks, something's wrong. And it's something that we can fix. I mean, it's a very common question when people talk about compost that says, I don't want to do that because I don't want to offend my neighbor with the smell, or I don't like the smell, or my wife doesn't like the smell, or whatever it might be. It's a very common question about compost stinking. But as I said, if it stinks, something's wrong. And in most cases, what's wrong is there's an absence of oxygen in the pile. That can be because the pieces are too little and they're too closely bound together. We're only trying to compost a single ingredient, all grass clippings, all leaves. And if it stinks, usually what it smells like is ammonia. And what that means is there's too much nitrogen in your pile. You've got to find a way to add some carbon, add some brown stuff. And sometimes you can, fix that just by turning it over, but add some brown stuff. In this situation, what I sometimes do is I'll have a bag of peat moss that I have around for other reasons, right? For my soil amendment. And if I find that it's starting to get a little ripe in there, I'll just throw some peat moss in and mix it in. It's adding additional carbon to the pile. The opposite of that is my compost isn't working. It's just not taking off. What's going on there? And frequently that's because you have too much carbon and not enough nitrogen. And that too much carbon can be, all I've got is leaves in there. All I've got is leaves and coffee grounds. And yeah, so you just need to add some nitrogen. So if you've got some green, you can add that. It's also possible just to add a couple of scoops of, high nitrogen lawn fertilizer or an organic lawn fertilizer will work. But those are the two biggest problems: is it smells bad, probably too much nitrogen, you got to add some brown stuff, or it doesn't work and probably too little nitrogen. You've got to find a way to add green stuff or maybe a fertilizer to get it started. But that question about will my composting stink is very common. I also want to talk about killing weed seeds. If composting it's an inexact science, but if it's done right, composting will kill most of the weed seeds that you're going to throw in there. Whether it's weeds, weeds from your garden, weeds from your lawn. Ideally, that pile you should be able to take a temperature and it'll reach 130, 60 degrees. Another way you can tell is just reach in the middle of the pile. If it's really hot, it's working and that's what you want. But what happens is, might be the right temperature in the middle of the pile, but maybe around the edge it is not. So it's one of those things where, you can throw some weed seeds in there, you can work it out, but I'd be a little careful about how much weed seeds you throw in. Just in some cases, it won't reach that right temperature. And some weed seeds are hardier than others. 130 degrees might kill some weed seeds, but maybe not others. And that doesn't get hot enough. And you take the compost next year and spread it around your garden, and then you've just seeded your garden with weeds you'll have to deal with. Want to talk a little bit about the picture here. This is a big pile of compost, and you'll notice that there isn't a structure. But I got this picture from the Texas A&M Extension Service, and it says that part of the reason this works is it's really hot in Texas, right? So they've got an advantage in terms of keeping things contained because the hot weather in Texas helps kind of kick that thing off. So here in Minnesota, really recommend some sort of structure. And in terms of structure, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. This is just a couple of pieces of screen that somebody bound together and they're using as a compost pile. And when I look at this, there's a couple of things I like about it. One of them is it's got a big open top. So when it comes time to turn this pile, you're going to be able to get a pitchfork or a shovel or whatever you're going to use in there pretty easily. You'll notice the sides are real open, so it's going to have airflow. It's going to get its oxygen, but yet it keeps everything's contained and kind of tall. So when you water this down, right, the water is going to kind of permeate through the different layers that it's got here. So the structure itself does not have to be anything fancy. I think this next slide, these pictures all came off the University of Minnesota Extension website, just a couple of different ideas. The one on the right, which has got the 3 levels, if you've got a significant amount of compost that you're building, you've got a significant amount of materials, excuse me, and you have space, this is really slick because you can start it in the first one, then when it's, gets cooking, you can turn it to the second one, gets cooking, you can turn to the third one, and the third one is the one you pull your compost out of. And you've always got like different stages of compost going on. I mean, that's pretty slick if you've got the raw material and the space to build something like this. The one on the bottom left is very similar to the one we just looked at. It's just a screen built around a very simple structure, but that works. The one on top left, when I look at that, I think if that thing were 2/3 full of compost that's kind of not very big on top, it'd be difficult to get a tool in there to turn it to find a way to turn it effectively. So you want to make sure when you make a structure that it's got those ingredients, that it's open to the air, that you can get water in it, that it'll maintain it, but it's also got a piece where you can actually reach in the top and turn that pretty effectively. And this is one of the compost bins that I have at my house. I like it because it's black, so that helps absorb the heat. The lid comes off. It's got a nice big top that I can pull stuff off. You can see the little drawer on the bottom. I'll pull that out at the end of the season and get out the full compost. But you know, there's a bunch of different structures. It really can be anything from 4 pallets stuck together to a piece of screen that you've bound together, to something like this, to something more extensive if that's what best suits your need. But the important thing is it kind of holds the compost together and doesn't let it spread out too far. And the other thing I want to talk about the structure is, you know, it's like buying real estate. The location of the structure is important. And the reason why it's important is you want to make sure you have really easy access to it. I'll tell you a quick story. We lived in Wisconsin, gosh, 20 years ago. And I had a really nice garden, but it was quite a ways from the house, and my compost pile was down near the garden. And I never took my kitchen scraps down there to the compost pile. It was just by the time I had my little household container full, it was too far to go. You know, it just wasn't convenient to do. So I encourage you to try and put that structure someplace where it's going to be convenient to you to get your compost material in it. You do want it a place where it won't interfere with the yard activity. You are going to have to water your compost pile periodically. You don't want it so it's just wide open. You know, I showed those compost structures with the screens. They work, but you don't want it like just out where you get a 30-mile wind and it dries it all out. And here in Minnesota particularly, you want to have some sunlight on there to help with heating the structure. But mine is outside the side door of my garage. So even in the winter, when my indoor kind of place that I collect my kitchen scraps is full, I will go out there and dump my compost bin in there because, you know, I literally don't even have to put boots on. I just go outside, open that lid and dump it in there. And the structure is important. It's a matter of convenience. If it's a long ways away, it makes it less likely that you'll actually tend the pile and make sure you get your scraps and all your garden material in it. So hopefully that makes sense. It makes sense to me. The pile itself, it's good if you're going to do this to start out with a pretty significant amount of material to compost. And this is kind of the structure that it recommends is you've got, I don't know, 6, 8, 10 inches of organic material, and then a layer of fertilizer or manure. That's kind of the nitrogen to get started, and the manure and soil are also a good source of the microbes. So the pile will typically start out like this, right? So you kind of work like this and let it sit for a while, but you are going to turn that pile. So all of this material, the organic material, the soil, the manure, it's all going to get mixed together eventually as you turn that pile. But in terms of starting it, what you don't want to have is, you know, 30 inches of organic material with a layer of manure on top, right? That isn't going to compost for you. You just want to make sure that it's hard to know, 6, 8, not more than 10 inches, I think you've got to have some layer that says, this is going to be the source of my microbial material. You want to build the pile 8 to 10 inches. You want to water till it's moist, but not soggy. I think of it as, you know, if you have a sponge and you get it wet and then you wring it out in your hand, the sponge is still wet, but it's not soggy and drippy. That's kind of the level of water that you want in your compost pile. You typically need some kind of nitrogen, although a lot of times if you've got a lot of green stuff, that can be your source of nitrogen. Adding nitrogen, this has 1/3 of a cup of high nitrogen fertilizer, that gets it started quicker. You know, that's a starter. If you've got a lot of green stuff in your pile, right, browns and greens, it will compost, but it takes longer to get going. But the source of this fertilizer gets it started quicker. Same thing with the livestock manure. That can be a good source of nitrogen, a good source of the microbes you need, and add a layer of soil. I've had great luck in terms of starting my compost with a couple of scoops of garden soil. You know, get a layer in, throw a couple of scoops of garden soil, get a layer in, and then just that garden soil is so rich in the, you know, it's good soil. It's got a lot of microbes, earthworm activity, you know, good healthy soil. There's a lot of stuff in there to help start your compost. So in terms of maintaining the pile, after a week or so, you should be able to tell if the pile is working. It should be noticeably warm inside the middle of that pile. And you can either, you know, stick your hand in there. I knew a guy who had an iron rod who put it in the middle of his compost pile, and then he could grab his rod because the iron conducted the heat out. And then you want to turn the pile. It says once or twice a month. You know, I turn mine whenever I think about it. You know, every few weeks I'll be out in the garden doing something, and on the way into the house, it's like, oh, I'm going to turn the pile. So there's nothing magic about the schedule. You just want to make sure that you kind of let it sit long enough so the microbial action can get going really good, get really hot, and then turn it to make sure all of the pieces get the chance in that really hot zone. Keep it moist but not soggy. Depending on what you're doing, if you've got a big piece in your compost unit, you don't want to get it half done and throw new raw material in there, because obviously they'll compost at different time. You won't get done at the same time. If you maintain a pile in Minnesota, you can turn your compost pile over every, you know, 2 to 4 months. And in the summer, you have 2 months, right? So that says in Minnesota, if you're really good at it, you can get 3 or 4 batches of compost in a year if you've got the material to compost. I think from my personal experience, to get four batches in a year would be really, like, you'd really have to have things work out well. And then lastly, maintaining it. When you're turning the pile, what's it smell like? And, you know, the people watching this presentation are all interested in compost. Most of them probably know what it smells like. It's got a real earthy smell to it, pleasant earthy smell. People have different ideas, but every time I smell like good fresh compost, it's like, oh yeah, this is the good stuff. There's nothing bitter about it or smell ammonia. It just smells like really good, healthy dirt. And then if you return it and it's not what it smells like, back to the earlier slide. If it's too ammonia E, you've got to add some carbon, get some brown stuff in there. If it's not working, it's all stuck together, just wet and sticky, you might need more nitrogen. In some cases, you might have to add some more of the microbial material to start it. My personal experience is that's pretty rare. If you've got good garden soil, a little manure, 1/3 of a cup of high nitrogen fertilizer to throw in there, that's plenty to get it started, and the microbes should take off from there. But occasionally that might be something if the other things aren't working. Yeah, so mix the pile at least twice a month. You know, and what that does is it speeds up the process and makes sure everything's get composted easily. Back to the thing about the longer you mixing it allows it essentially to introduce more of the material that the microbes feed on, and it can keep that high temperature going for a longer period of time. If you just put a pile together, start it, and never touch it, within a period of time, the microbes will have consumed all of the, you know, all the food that they're looking for, and it'll start to cool down. So the purpose of turning it is really to kind of make sure that that active microbe community has still got all of the material there that it can work on and feed on. Yeah, we've talked about this a little bit. You know, not too big, not too small. If the pieces are too small, they stick together and they shut out the oxygen. That makes your pile stink or stop. If you're going to use leaves, it's really important that you mulch the leaves and kind of let them dry before you put it in the compost pile. You can't use whole leaves that, you know, stick together to form a mat, because again, they're too close together, doesn't let the oxygen in them. Yeah, too small limits the airspace. You got to find something bigger that breaks it up. If you're using things over 2 inches, you know, it makes for really slow. A good mix is always best. And yeah, I mean, you know, to me, that the not too big, not too small, and a mix of materials has always worked well for me. You know, that's whenever I look at it with something of a problem, it's like, oh, you know, I should have broken that up before I threw it in there. Let me chop that up a little bit and stir it up and see how it goes. Another question we get is how big the pile has to be. And I don't have a definitive answer for that. But if it's too small, you know, I'm trying to make something with my hands. Like this is too small. You know, it's got to be, I don't know, 15, 20 gallons. It's hard to imagine that you could get an active compost pile with something much smaller than that. You know, if it's too small, it doesn't have enough nitrogen. You know, it doesn't hold the moisture, so it's continually drying out. You want to make sure when you start your compost pile that you've got a pretty significant amount of material that you're trying to turn into compost. The other thing is if your pile is too small and it works perfect, you know, you're only going to get a gallon of compost out of it. Well, you know, that's probably, I think it takes the same amount of work to compost a little pile as it does a big pile. If you can get enough material, you'll just get a lot more return at the end of it. Another question we get is, do I need to add lime? And I think the answer would be, it would be very rare that you would need to add lime to a compost pile in Minnesota. You add lime because the pile itself is too acidic. It needs something alkaline to kind of bring it down. And lime is one of the ways to do that. Wood ash is another one that will bring it down, right? That's the purpose of when people add wood ash, is to make sure that it's not too acidic. But to me, it's very rare that you would actually need to add lime to a compost pile in Minnesota. If you're doing a bunch of pine needles, that's one way it can happen. And if you've got if a significant portion of your pile is fruit waste, right, that can make it too acidic. But you know, again, if it's a good mix, the University of Minnesota, I just literally came right off their website. It'd be very rare that you would need to add lime to a compost pile in Minnesota. We talked briefly about this. This is direct composting, which is instead of putting it in a bin or a structure, you compost it directly into the ground, into the garden. And this does work. I have done this. You just dig a little trench, make sure that it's deep enough so that you can spread it out. You don't want the kitchen waste to be, you know, 6 inches thick. You want it just a few inches thick across the garden. Put a good layer of soil on it, wet it down, and very quickly that will decompose into compost and be a good accoutrement to your soil. But yeah, but this does work. You know, if you just say, hey, you know, the structure is more than I want to get involved with, make a little trench in your garden or your lawn and dump your kitchen waste right in it, cover it up, and see how that goes for you. In most cases, that's going to compost very quickly and be a great additive to your soil. Another question we get is, when is the pile done? And to me, the second point here is probably the most important. It's when most of the components look and smell like compost, which is a real earthy, broken down. The compost, it will not be the case that everything you put in there will no longer be recognized because some things compost at different speeds. It's very common in my case that at the end of this season, I will have some, for example, some twigs that still look like twigs. You know, you can probably tell that some of the decomposition process has started, but they're still recognizable, and that's okay. You're going to take that stuff and put it in the garden, and it'll have all winter to finish composting, or even if it's not done next summer, that kind of microbial action will continue as you work your garden. This says about half the size when it started. I guess my experience would be it's more like a third of the size. And again, whether it's half the size or a third of the size depends on the material that you're composting. But yeah, at some point you kind of look at it and go and just go, boy, this looks good. This looks like something that if I added it to my yard or garden, I'd be doing it a favor. And that's when your compost is done. Real earthy smell. Like I said, it's not an exact science. It's kind of like, yeah, I think this worked. I'm going to put this someplace where it's going to go benefit my soil. What do you do with compost? You can use it for mulch, top dressing, reduce soil erosion. To me, it's a great accoutrement to the soil for top dressing and then working the top couple of lawns. We don't recommend using it as potting soil because after a while it compacts and it gets really hard. I happen to know that two ways. One is I read it on the University of Minnesota Extension website, and I have personal experience screwing up a fern that way. So, you can add it as an accoutrement to the soil, the potting soil, but you don't want it to just use it for potting soil. And I'm back to where we talked about, right? So the Master Gardener helpline, copy down that number if you've got questions and you want somebody to look that up and do research, and a Master Gardener will get back to you. Your University of Minnesota Extension website, if you want to look it up yourself. If you want a more technical discussion about composting that talks about the chemistry and carbon to nitrogen ratio, how much water, how do you determine, if you want a more technical discussion, this link here will take you to a pretty scientific paper on the University of Minnesota Extension website. You can also get there by going to the Extension website, type in composting in the search, and then one of the results that come up will be this paper. But it's a lot more technical piece. So I feel like I've been talking steady for a little bit too long. Let's get to questions. Sorry that took so long.
All right, Bill, thank you very much. That was a really great presentation. So much information there. Again, I want to apologize. I had to interrupt you there in the beginning for a little technical difficulty.
Oh, no.
But
Please do.
I appreciate you talking to everyone about the Carver-Scott Master Gardeners and the Extension Master Gardeners as a whole. So thank you. All right, well, let's dig into questions. So we have, let's see, our first one here. So we have a question on eggshells. It says, I let them dry out and then crush them. I have never rinsed them. Is that okay?
I really don't know the answer to that. I guess if letting them dry out, to me, if that implies there's still some of the raw egg in there that perhaps is dry, I might recommend against that. Because, the whole thing is, it's ultimately an animal product and that process is different. The truth is, I think eggshells are normally such a small percentage of the compost pile. It's probably okay, but my gut tells me that's one of those things where, like, occasionally you might run into a problem with that.
Okay, and then I will piggyback that with another question about eggshells. Is my compost working if eggshells and avocado skins are still whole when compost is harvested?
I've always struggled with avocado skins. I don't know what it is about those things. So I don't know about that. If the rest of the pile is turning into compost and it's everything but the eggshells, that's I might say crush the eggshells into smaller pieces, because I personally have not experienced that, and I'm not sure what I know eggshells should compost, and they break down the same way leaves do, right? It's a microbial action that breaks down the calcium in the shells. So it's hard to say that it's not working if it works for everything else, but to me there is something a little odd if you still got whole eggshells. But again, I don't know what's going on with avocado skins.
Okay, you mentioned the acidity of the pile. How do you measure the acidity, and does it relate to the heat of the pile?
So acidity does not relate to the heat of the pile. It relates more to the makeup of the material of the pile itself. And let's see if it is too acidic, then let me back up a little bit. because I don't know how you actually measure the acidity of the pile. But if your pile consists of a large number of a large component of materials that have got a high acid content, and you can actually get that from the University of Minnesota Extension website, right? And your compost pile is not working very well, then it might be worth saying, hey, I'm going to throw some lime in this and see if this works. As I said, it's kind of an inexact science, but if you are struggling with that, I don't think there's any harm in adding lime to it. It's just, it's a base. If that brings it down and then it kicks off, then I think that'll be the answer to the question. We probably need to trial and error this a little bit, but in terms of measuring the actual acidity of the pile, I've always just kind of looked at the ingredients and said, is that high acidic or low? What percentage of it is my pine needles? What percentage is my fruit? There's a few other high acidic items that I can't think of right now that I'd kind of look for in the pile.
And then, Bill, does that relate to the heat of the pile, the acidity level?
I don't think that by itself relates to the heat of the pile, but what does happen if it's too acidic, it affects the you can think about this, it affects the microbial action, because it's the action of the microbes as they consume the pile that gives off the heat. And if they can't get going, then the pile won't get warm enough. So if the question is, if it's too acidic, will that ultimately affect the heat? The answer is yes, but the heat's a byproduct of saying the microbial action isn't working.
Okay, can you use bagged manure for starter?
Yeah, I have done that. My only hesitancy is I didn't read that on the University of Minnesota Extension website, but yes, you can use bag manure. Now, having said that, sometimes with bag manure, they actually sterilize it, right? Which means they heat it up because people don't want it to smell like manure. So I would check the bag itself and see kind of what the process it went through is. I would think if you use that and some garden soil, that it'd work for you.
Okay, I bought a small under cabinet container for under my kitchen sink. It's vented at the bottom and came with compostable bags. However, once I got it home, I read the box and the bags are really only compostable in more of an industrial composter. Do you know of any bags that might work? I hate to generate more plastic waste. I try to reuse the bag, but they smell and fall apart with the vents. And with the vents, I do need a bag.
Yeah, right off the top of my head, I do not. We'd have to do a little research and see. I have a kitchen counter compost bin, which does not have vents and has a carbon filter on top that's worked well for years. But yeah, the vents in the bottom are really interesting. And she said this was the question was, this is under counter, right?
Yep, the small under cabinet container for under the kitchen sink.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the purpose of the vents are in that situation. But yeah, right off the top of my head, I do not know of compostable bags.
Okay, I wonder if just a good Google search might be able to find something that would work for that.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, are coffee grounds considered brown or green?
Brown, and they're great brown. Yeah, they're a great source of the carbon that you need to get things going. So yeah, I'm a big fan of coffee grounds. I even know one person who actually gets coffee grounds from a coffee shop, like big quantities of it, and does this massive compost with them.
Okay. We have a potential location that is easy to access but is shady. Is that okay?
Does it get any sun at all? I think that in Minnesota, if you have a spot that doesn't get any sun, it would, at the very least, reduce the speed at which the process would work. If everything else was there, you could probably get away with it because it does generate its own heat. But because, even in July in Minnesota, you can have what, 50-degree nights, right? Which are pretty cool. And we frequently don't get those really hot days that, you know, bake things like they do down in Texas. So I'd be a little, if it doesn't get any sun, like I said, I think if it worked perfectly, you could still get away with it. To me, that means you tend it more. It'd be a little more labor intensive to make sure it goes. You'd have to make sure you've always got the right mixture of material and stuff and a good microbe. It might work. It might work. But the way I think of it, it's one of those things where it'll work until something goes wrong and then it'll stall. Where in most compost piles, if something goes wrong, it doesn't actually stall the whole pile, right? It just means, oh, I've got to turn it again. I've got to add something.
Okay, and that question came from Michael F. Michael F., if you have any more comments on the type of shade, you know, is it trees, is it buildings, what's blocking it?
Yeah, does it get any sun?
Come back to that. Another one, I have always just added more materials to the top of my compost bin. What did you mean when you said not to add, but to start a new pile?
So that's actually referring to a different kind of compost than what I generally was talking about. There is a process called continual composting, where you add materials perhaps throughout the summer, and then in the fall, you know, let it go for a few weeks or a month by itself and be done. I'm hesitating a little bit because this is not from the University of Minnesota. The thing about those piles is they don't get as warm. If you are continually adding new stuff and kind of turning it over, those piles will not get as warm as the traditional compost, which is a single start to finish process. And that means, you know, not getting as warm means they're not going to kill the same amount of weeds. They're not going to kill the weed seeds. You know, you're going to have more carry on. Things that are harder to compost, it'll be less successful.
Okay, it looks like we have a follow-up question, or excuse me, follow-up to the previous question about the shade area for it. It says it's between the garage and a pine tree and is shaded about 80% of the day. Does this sound like I should find a better location if I want to tend it less often?
If you could. You know, if you could, but again, I think 80% of the day. So I don't know when that is. You know, if it gets some good afternoon sun, you know, it's probably worth giving it a go. But in an ideal circumstance, it would probably get more sun than that. And again, largely that's just a nod to our Minnesota summers, which aren't, you know, some summers are hot and sun beaten, and some aren't.
Okay, I think I skipped this one here. So what is the right balance of picking up versus leaving clippings in the lawn? So I'm biased on this one.
I think that unless you're cutting your lawn so infrequently that you've literally got piles of grass clippings on your lawn, you should leave them all on your lawn. To me, there's very little reason in terms of benefit to the lawn that says I would ever pick up a grass clipping. Now, some people pick up grass clippings because they like the aesthetic. Some people pick up grass clippings because they use it for mulch. You know, there are other reasons why people do it, but the University of Minnesota would say that in terms of the health of the lawn, leaving the grass clippings on there, they will decompose quickly. And I can tell you that if you leave your grass clippings on your lawn, you can get away with applying about 1/3 less nitrogen to your lawn in the form of fertilizer than if you pick them up. But it is true, you know, back to what I said earlier, if the grass is so long that when I cut it, you've got piles and it's matting together, you know, and I'm not talking about a dry pile, but it mats and then the inside of it's wet and yucky. That's that anaerobic thing that smells and kind of smother. Like that would be a problem. But again, my bias, my strong bias, and this part is backed by the University of Minnesota, is in most cases, you're better off just leaving the grass clippings on the lawn. There's a theory out there that leaving grass clippings cause thatch. That's incorrect. Gosh, last week at this very event, there was a presentation on lawn care where they talked about the benefits of leaving grass clippings on the lawn.
Okay, another follow-up. What would the ideal amount of sun be?
So I don't think you can have too much sun, but if you have a lot of sun, you want to make sure that it's not such that it dries out the pile. So for an example, if you remember the compost bin that I use, which has got pretty solid sides, there's a few vents in there, that has got full sun, like literally during the summer, I don't know, 12 or 13 or 14 hours a day, but it's pretty well shielded from the wind. It's just got some vents in there. If your compost pile has a lot of vents, so the sun is going to dry it out, you know, then you would want something less than that, or it takes more tending. But I don't have a percentage for the ideal amount, but the purpose of the sun is to aid, to keep this pile warm as it goes through its microbial breakdown.
Okay, my compost has been mostly leaves. I have gotten nice dirt from that, but is it very useful for my garden? Does it have enough of the beneficial things needed for the plants?
So, right, leaves are going to break down to be mostly carbon-based. They're not going to be very nitrogen-based. But that's actually okay, because compost by itself is not very nutrient-rich. Like, you don't add compost to your garden because this is going to be a substitute for fertilizer. You mainly add compost to your garden because it's a good accoutrement for the soil. It adds organic matter, it adds nutrients, it creates structure in the soil. But compost itself is not nutrient rich. So if I interpreted the question correctly about is it good for my plants, like in no case are you going to use compost as a substitute for fertilizer. So Christy, I'm going to ask you, did that make sense what I just said? I felt like I kind of tripped on it.
Yep, nope, that's fine. So if you're composting, and maybe I'll ask a secondary question then, the main one in front of me. If you're composting, then do you find it necessary to add fertilizer as well?
Yes, compost is not a substitute for fertilizer. Compost is mainly an accoutrement for the soil. It improves the health of your soil, but the compost itself is not very high in nutrients because it's gone through this kind of decomposition process, right? It's consumed a lot of that. So yeah, you don't want to use compost as a substitute for your fertilizer.
Okay, and this one's...
I'm going to have to add that to the presentation. That's an important point.
Please talk about worm casings that people add to their bin. Where do they get them?
So I'm far from an expert on worm casings. But I do know that there are people that add worm casings to their compost bins as another way to kind of process the soil. I also know that you can order online worms that produce these casings, or worm casings. But I'm far from an expert. I probably have said enough on that. That might be a great question to ask at the University of Minnesota Extension Helpline. Right, ask that question, and then someone more knowledgeable would do research and get back to you.
Okay. What are your thoughts on corn cobs? I've thrown them into my pile, but they don't seem to compost too well. Should I not do it, or am I doing it wrong?
I've not had luck with corn cobs either. So I have a good friend who's a farmer. The striking thing is, right, he picks a field of corn with thousands of cobs in it, and the next spring they're gone, or shortly thereafter they're gone. But I've also not had luck composting corn cobs, so I don't think it means you're doing it wrong. It must just be that the corn cobs themselves don't do well in that environment. So yeah, I don't have a great answer for that, but I'm sure that if you took the corn cobs into smaller pieces, it would probably work. But I've also thrown corn cobs in at sweet corn season, and they're still there when I take them out the end of the year.
Okay, are there certain leaves that should not be used? there's two parts to this question. So one is, are there certain leaves that should not be used? And the second part is, and will it make a difference if those leaves are shredded?
I think I'm not aware of any leaves that should not be used, unless they're diseased or have got heavy chemical or they've got a blight or something like that. But in terms of, and I assume we're talking mainly about tree leaves here. I am not aware of any tree leaves that that should be avoided personally. And the second question about should they be shredded, my answer to that is all the leaves should be shredded. And the reason is what you don't want is the leaves to pile on top of each other, right? We've all seen that. And then it forms a mat. And then air can't get in, water can't get in. Between them, there's no oxygen. And then you get that ammonia smell from that anaerobic process. So in an ideal world, the leaves are dry and then mulched or shredded and then added to the pile.
Okay, it looks like we have the last question here. So before I read that, I want to let everyone know if you have any final questions here. We'll take just a couple more. If you want to type those in the Q&A box, that would be great. And then we'll go through this question and we'll see if anything else comes in. Do critters like to take up residence in the compost piles?
Sometimes. So I've heard of people, I've not had a big trouble with critters, but one thing about the compost pile itself is every couple of weeks you're turning it, and critters don't like to have their homes destroyed every couple of weeks. So it hasn't, I personally, I've heard of that, but I personally have not experienced it. You know, you've got some kind of shelter around it they could get in. I don't think that's a big problem. I have heard of that instance, but I don't think it's a big problem, partly because A, it gets really hot, and B, you tend it, right? You keep turning it over, so it's not a stable place for critters to make their home for the summer.
Okay, well, I didn't see any additional questions come in. So Bill, is there anything you want to say before we sign off here for the night?
I think the only thing I want to say is thank everybody for attending. These presentations are fun. They're more fun in person. Hopefully the next time we can be face-to-face when we do this. But I always think of my great questions after I hang up the phone or get off the computer. And if that happens, call that Master Gardener helpline, because really smart people will look at that. And if they don't know the answer, they'll send it to someone who does, or they'll do the research and get you a good answer back.
Great. Well, Bill, thanks again for putting this presentation on tonight. I got a little distracted because there's some chats coming in and they're just saying thank you very much, and it was very informative. So a few of our attendees right now are thanking you, Bill. I do want to mention that next week we have another one of these webinars on Wednesday, and it is April 29th. We are doing container gardening. That again will start at 6:30, so watch social media or whichever way you have been getting the information about it. There'll be another one coming. Also on Saturday mornings, we do have our open Q&A session. So we have some garden chit chats and talks, and are able to answer questions as well. So please tune in for those.
Hey, Christy, I'm sorry, what time, is that at 9:30?
That one is at 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock, okay. I just wanted to make sure people know it's at 10 o'clock.
Yeah, thank you. And then other than that, I did want to mention the Yard and Garden line one more time, 952-466-5308. And please feel free to call that if we didn't get to any of your questions, or if you think of something again after we close out here tonight. So with that, I think we will go ahead and say goodnight. So thanks again, Bill.
My pleasure. Have a good evening. It's a beautiful night. You can still get outside.
Right. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.